Carrying legally may now get you killed. That's the contradiction at the center of the Alex Pretti case. The government says it supports lawful gun ownership, yet after Pretti was shot and killed, officials pointed not to an attack, not to a crime, but to his preparedness. An extra magazine, they said, suggested nefarious intent. That detail was used to define the encounter after it was over. Readiness itself has been recast as suspicion. If you carry legally, this isn't theoretical. This is about you. It means the moment a badge enters the scene, the assumptions flip. What you believed was responsibility can suddenly be framed as a threat. And once that frame is set, everything that follows becomes easier to justify. But here's the part nobody says directly. This story didn't drift into place. It arrived fast, unified, and from the top. The language was ready. The explanation was immediate, almost rehearsed. So the real question isn't just why Alex Pretti died. It's why the narrative was waiting for him the moment he did. What happened next was framed as a single incident, but it didn't stay that way for long. After the Minneapolis shooting, the focus wasn't on confusion, timing, or competing accounts. It narrowed quickly onto Alex Pretti himself, his equipment, his choices, his intent. Officials emphasized that what he carried mattered more than what he did. An extra magazine became a central detail in how the event was explained. The presence of gear was elevated into motive. That framing matters because it shifts the story away from a moment and into a pattern. This wasn't presented as a tragic edge case. It was treated like a lesson. The implication was subtle but powerful. Certain forms of lawful behavior now carry an inherent suspicion when law enforcement is involved. Notice what's missing here. There was no pause to establish facts before character judgments appeared, no public uncertainty, no "we're still reviewing." Instead, the narrative arrived almost fully formed, suggesting this wasn't just about one man, but about setting a boundary. So here's the question that reframes everything. If legality isn't the shield anymore, what exactly is the rule people are expected to follow? Here's the claim that changes how you have to read this story. Alex Pretti wasn't framed as dangerous because of violence. He was framed as dangerous because of proximity. Officials emphasized that approaching law enforcement while armed creates an extreme risk. The message was explicit. The closer you are, the more justified lethal force becomes. The act of being armed near authority is itself treated as escalation. That idea didn't come from speculation. It came from how the situation was described after the fact. The focus wasn't on whether Pretti fired, threatened, or ignored commands. The focus was on the likelihood that officers would be legally justified in shooting someone who was armed during an encounter. That phrasing matters. It reframes the event from a tragedy into a foreseeable outcome. But notice what's missing. There's no space in that logic for intent to help. No room for misunderstanding, no allowance for lawful carry. Once the threshold is crossed, legality stops being protection and starts being a liability. This is where the story quietly flips. The right itself isn't denied on paper, it's neutralized in practice at the exact moment it would matter most. Once that logic is accepted, escalation becomes automatic. The Pretti case wasn't treated as an outlier. It was normalized almost immediately. The language used suggested this was how these encounters are expected to end. Armed citizen approaches law enforcement, risk spikes, lethal force becomes foreseeable. Officials described the shooting as legally justifiable under that framework. The framework itself is being defended, not questioned. There's a quiet precedent here, and it isn't distant. For years, policy debates have circled around when force is reasonable. What's different now is how early that line is being drawn. Not at violence, not at threat, but at presence. Being armed in the wrong proximity is enough. This is where something dangerous becomes routine. When justification is preloaded, investigation becomes secondary. The outcome is explained before it's examined. That's how extraordinary actions turn into standard procedure. And here's why that matters. Once a behavior is normalized at the federal level, it doesn't stay isolated. It spreads downward. Training, expectations, assumptions, all of it shifts quietly. Now watch how fast this stops being about one shooting and starts becoming doctrine. The next layer is where the contradiction hardens. While officials defended the shooting as legally justified, they also spoke in the language of rights. Support for lawful carry, respect for the Second Amendment. Those words stayed in place even as the practical message moved in the opposite direction. The same administration that campaigned as friendly to gun owners defended the framing that made Pretti's gear suspicious. Rights are being affirmed rhetorically while narrowed operationally. Look at the mismatch. On one side, public assurances that lawful gun ownership is protected. On the other, a post-incident narrative that treats standard equipment as evidence of danger. The two can't coexist for long. One of them has to give in the moment of enforcement. Here's the detail that changes how you see it. The justification didn't rely on chaos or confusion, it relied on predictability. The argument was that this outcome was likely, even expected, given the circumstances. That turns a defensive explanation into a warning. And once a warning is established, behavior changes. Not for the state, but for everyone else. You're being told indirectly which rights are safe to exercise and which ones carry unacceptable risk. So the question shifts again. If words say one thing and enforcement signals another, which one actually governs reality? Then the pressure starts stacking, not slowly, all at once. First, the narrative hardens around justification, then it's echoed by multiple officials, then it's reinforced by silence from the top, where a correction could have landed but didn't. No senior figure reversed or softened the framing after it took hold. The framing was acceptable, if not intentional. At the same time, the story narrows. Competing interpretations fade. The focus locks onto equipment, proximity, and risk assessment. Each repetition makes the conclusion feel more inevitable. This wasn't an error. It was the cost of the situation. That's how it's presented. Here's what makes this a mini-crisis instead of a single controversy. The message is moving faster than policy ever does. Before laws change, behavior does. Officers absorb it. Citizens sense it. The balance shifts without a vote or a ruling. And notice the acceleration. There's no cooling off period, no visible internal debate, just a rapid consolidation around one explanation that leaves no room for ambiguity. So ask yourself this. If the system is already behaving as if the rules have changed, what happens if this continues? Now pull the camera away from officials and put it where it actually lands. On you. On ordinary people trying to make sense of the rules they live under. Because the real impact of this story isn't legal theory, it's behavior. The message being broadcast is that lawful carry near law enforcement dramatically increases the risk of being shot. People are being quietly trained to choose between their safety and their rights. Think about how that changes daily decisions. Do you intervene if something feels wrong? Do you step forward or stay back? Do you make yourself visible or invisible? When the cost of being mistaken is fatal, hesitation becomes rational. Silence becomes safer than action. This strips ideology out of it. It doesn't matter how you vote, it matters how you survive. A system that treats preparedness as provocation teaches people to disengage, to look away, to avoid becoming involved at all. And that has consequences no press conference can undo. Trust erodes. Communities pull inward. The space between citizens and authority grows wider, not because of slogans, but because of fear. If this feels familiar, say so in the comments. Because recognition is how patterns become visible. To understand how this happens, you have to look past outrage and into incentives. Systems don't move on emotion, they move on risk management. The official framing prioritizes officer safety above all other considerations. Once that priority is absolute, every armed civilian becomes a variable to be neutralized, not a right to be accommodated. This is how power protects itself without announcing a policy shift. No law is changed, no amendment is challenged. Instead, interpretation does the work. The standard quietly becomes not "is this legal?" but "does this feel risky?" and feelings are easier to defend than rules. Here's the unsettling part. This approach doesn't require bad actors. It works through alignment. Prosecutors want defensible cases. Agencies want reduced liability. Leaders want quiet crises. The safest path for the system is the one that justifies force early, not one that questions it later. That's why this story feels different from a normal controversy. It's not about one decision. It's about a mechanism that rewards caution for the state and transfers danger to the citizen. And once that mechanism is in place, it doesn't need constant reinforcement. It runs on its own. From here, the trajectory splits, but neither path is comfortable. One possibility is consolidation. The framing holds, the precedent settles. Future cases reference this one implicitly, even when they don't cite it directly. Over time, armed citizens learned the boundary through cautionary tales, not court rulings. Narratives shape expectations before laws ever do. Behavior adapts faster than rights can be defended. The other path is friction. Pushback builds, slowly and unevenly, not through sweeping reform, but through hesitation, withdrawal, and disengagement. People stop stepping in, stop cooperating, stop trusting that legality will protect them in moments of stress. The system still functions, but it does so with less participation and more distance. Notice the uncertainty here. There's no clean resolution forming, no clear signal that this gets corrected quickly. What's forming instead is momentum. Each similar incident will be read through the same lens, reinforcing whichever path is already taking shape. And here's the part to watch closely. The next move won't come from a courtroom first. It will come from behavior on the ground, from what people decide is worth the risk. That decision is already being made, quietly, case by case. There's one insight that ties all of this together. This isn't about guns or policing or even Alex Pretti alone. It's about how rights change meaning when risk is redefined. A right that exists only until it makes authority uncomfortable isn't really a right. It's a conditional allowance. Nothing in this case required a new law to change behavior. The shift happened through narrative, not legislation, through what was emphasized, what was defended, and what was left unsaid. That's how systems evolve without announcing themselves. Seen this way, the Pretti case isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of a pattern, one where legality no longer guarantees protection, only permission to be judged after the fact. And that's the loop this leaves open, not what happened, but what happens next. Because once people understand the rules have changed in practice, they adjust, quietly, permanently. If you want to keep tracking where this trajectory leads and how these patterns repeat before they're obvious, follow and subscribe. This story isn't done. It's just revealed its direction.